The glass hit the wall before Sandra even saw it coming. 1 second she was standing. The next, she was on the floor, ears ringing, staring at the ceiling of her own bedroom while the man she married stood over her like she was something he'd accidentally broken and was deciding whether to fix. He wasn't deciding to fix it. Maya saw everything through the crack in the door. 7 years old, barefoot, clutching a stuffed rabbit so hard its ear was about to come off. And in that moment, that small, terrifying, decisive moment, she did something that would change for lives forever. She grabbed the phone. She dialed. Wrong number. Somewhere beneath Seoul's neon skyline, in a room where silence was enforced, not requested. A phone rang. A phone that had been dead for 2 years. Every man in that room turned to stone. Kong Minj looked at the screen, looked at his men, and picked up. Pleased, he's hurting my mummy. He was already standing. Track it. That one call. That one wrong number dialed by a 7-year-old in the dark. It just started a war. Where are you watching this from right now? Seriously, drop your city or your country in the comments below. I want to see exactly who showed up for this one. And if you are new here, hit that subscribe button before this story swallows you whole, because we are not slowing down. Not tonight. Not for anything. Now. Let's go back to before the glass hit the wall. Because to understand what happened that night, you need to understand Sandra Whitman. And Sandra Whitman is not a simple woman to understand. She had come to Seoul 3 years before on what she used to call the most optimistic decision of her life. She said that with a laugh, usually. The kind of laugh that lives in the throat and never quite reaches the eyes. She was a Black American woman in her early 30s, a trained medical translator who spoke 4 languages and could navigate a foreign hospital system faster than most people navigate a grocery store. Smart. Funny when she was comfortable. Fiercely protective of the people she loved. The problem was she had spent the last several years loving the wrong person. Darius Whitman was charming the way a rip current is charming. You don't notice it's pulling you under until you are already too far from shore to swim back. He was tall, well-dressed, and he had this way of making Sandra feel seen that nobody else had ever managed. In the beginning, anyway. In the beginning there were flowers and late-night conversations, and a proposal on a bridge over the Han River that made her cry in the good way. Maya came 11 months after the wedding. The flowers stopped about 6 months after Maya. Sandra told herself it was stress. She told herself it was the pressure of being foreigners in a new city, of Darius struggling to find stable work, of the financial weight landing mostly on her shoulders. She made excuses the way desperate people make excuses, creatively, devotedly, and with enormous personal cost. But here is what excuses cannot do. They cannot explain away a bruise. They cannot talk their way around a little girl who has started flinching every time a door slams. They cannot dress up a bedroom that has become a place Sandra dreads entering at night. By the time that glass hit the wall, Sandra had been surviving Darius for 2 years. And Maya had been watching her survive him for almost as long. That night had started like most bad nights started in that apartment. Quietly. Darius came home late, smelling like something expensive and something unspoken, and Sandra made the mistake of asking where he had been. Not accusingly. Just asking. The way a wife asks. The way a tired woman who has been managing a household and a child and a full-time job all by herself just needs to know she is not completely invisible in her own marriage. That was enough. That was always enough. The argument escalated the way those arguments always did. Fast and then faster. Words becoming weapons, the air in the room thinning like it did at altitude until Sandra couldn't breathe right, and Darius was no longer the man she married, but something else entirely. Something with no ceiling on it. And then the glass. And then the floor. Maya did not think. She did not plan. She was 7 and she was terrified, and her brain had exactly one instruction running in it at that moment, which was, get help, get help, get help now. She had seen her mother dial emergency numbers before. She had a rough memory of the sequence. But Maya's hands were shaking and the apartment was dark except for the light bleeding under the bedroom door, and she punched the numbers with her thumb the way a child punches numbers. Not carefully. Not carefully at all. But here is where the story stops being ordinary. Because that misdial? That specific, trembling, terrified combination of wrong digits. It connected to a line that, according to every record that existed in any official system, did not exist. The phone in Kong Minj's office rang once. His head of security, a man named Cho who had the emotional range of a parking meter, actually stepped backward. Minj looked at the device like it had just spoken his name out loud. "That line has been inactive for 2 years," Cho said carefully. "I know. It shouldn't be able to receive." "I know." Minj picked up.
"Now."
"Before we go any further, because you need context before this next part lands the way it's supposed to land, you need to understand who Kong Minj actually was. If you are enjoying the story so far, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now. It genuinely helps, and this story is only getting started. In Seoul's criminal ecosystem, Minj was not the loudest name. He was the quietest one. And in that world, quiet means powerful in a way that loud never can. He had built something over 12 years that operated like a shadow organization, fingers in logistics, private security, underground finance, and 3 or 4 other industries that do not have clean names. He was 36 years old. He was Korean, privately educated, and visually unremarkable in the way that genuinely dangerous people often are. No flash, no performance, just the absolute certainty of a man who has never once needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted. His men were loyal the way men are loyal when loyalty is the only rational option. He had not been in a relationship since a woman named Ji-yeon 3 years ago. That detail matters later.
"Keep it."
The meeting he was in that night when the phone rang was with 4 men who controlled the Eastern Shipping Corridor out of Incheon. It was a meeting that had taken 6 weeks to arrange. There were figures on a table. There were handshakes pending. Minj walked out of all of it the moment he heard Maya's voice. Not dramatically. Not with explanation. He simply stood up, said "track it," and walked to the window while his men scrambled. Cho had the coordinates in under 4 minutes. Here is where it gets crazy. The address that came back? Minj had been to that building before. Not that apartment. Not Sandra's unit. But that building. 2 years ago. For a reason he had not spoken about since. He stared at the address on Cho's tablet for exactly 3 seconds. Then, move. All of us. Cho blinked. Sir, the meeting was already over. Nobody argued with that tone. Nobody ever argued with that tone. Downstairs, 3 black vehicles pulled out of the underground garage and into Seoul's rain-slicked streets like something that was done waiting. The city blurred past the windows in streaks of red and gold and white, the Han River visible between buildings, bridges lit like jewelry against dark water, the kind of beauty that exists completely indifferent to whatever human crisis is unfolding beneath it. In the back seat, Minj held the phone. The line was still open. He could hear, faintly, the sound of a man's voice somewhere in the background of wherever Maya was hiding. Angry. Moving through rooms. Getting closer. Minj said nothing. He just listened. And something happened in his face that the men in the front seat had enough survival instinct not to comment on. Back in the apartment, Maya had pressed herself into the back corner of the kitchen cupboard beneath the sink, her knees pulled to her chest, the phone clutched against her ear, her stuffed rabbit squashed between her and the cleaning supplies. She could hear Darius. He was in the hallway now. Maya. His voice had gone soft. That was somehow worse than the shouting. Maya, baby, come out. Daddy's not angry. She did not move. She heard him try the bathroom door. Then the second bedroom. Then his footsteps stopped outside the kitchen. The cupboard door handle moved.
Wait.
Hold on. Because at this exact moment downstairs, the 3 black vehicles were pulling up to the building. It was going to come down to seconds. Darius's hand was on the handle. Maya had stopped breathing. The handle turned. The front door of the apartment came off its hinges. Not knocked. Not kicked once politely. It came off with the kind of force that communicates very specifically that the people entering do not care even slightly about the security deposit. 6 men flooded in. Darius spun around. And then Minj walked through the door. Slowly. No rush. Like a man entering a room he already owns. Darius opened his mouth. Minj looked at him with a particular expression of someone doing extremely fast and extremely unfavorable arithmetic. You broke into my... Darius started. Where is she? It was not a question. The cupboard door opened from the inside. Maya looked up at 6 enormous men in dark clothing and an extremely calm Korean man in an expensive jacket, and despite every instinct that should have told her to scream, she didn't. She looked at Minj specifically, the way children sometimes look at the one adult in a chaotic room who actually has their heartbeat under control, and she said in a very small voice, Are you the man from the phone? Minj crouched down to her level. Yes. Did you come to help my mummy? A pause that lasted less than a second but somehow contained a great deal. Yes. Maya held out her arms. And here is the moment that Minj's men would quietly discuss for the next 3 months, because their boss, the man who once conducted an entire high-stakes negotiation while someone was pointing a gun at his head without so much as loosening his collar, picked up a 7-year-old he had never met and held her against his chest like it was something he already knew how to do. Nobody said anything. Darius, to his credit, understood the room. He took 1 step backward, then another. 2 of Minj's men moved to collect Sandra from the bedroom where she had dragged herself against the wall, conscious but barely, her arm at an angle that made the men's jaws tighten. She was lifted with more gentleness than she expected from people who looked like that. Darius watched all of this with an expression cycling rapidly between rage and something very close to fear. Minj finally looked at him properly. Touch them again, he said, conversationally, almost pleasantly, and I will know about it before you finish the thought. He didn't wait for a response. He walked out with Maya still in his arms. If you're enjoying this story right now, this is the moment where you should subscribe if you haven't yet. Seriously, hit the button. There is so much more to come, and it only gets wilder from here. The private clinic was 40 minutes south of the city, and it didn't have a sign outside. It had a gate, a guard, and a doctor named Park who had worked for Minj's organization for 7 years and asked very few questions because the answers were always complicated. It was sterile and well-equipped and profoundly not the kind of place that submits insurance claims. Sandra was brought in on a stretcher. Dr. Park assessed her with the focused efficiency of someone who has treated injuries before that told stories nobody was going to officially tell, and his expression, which was professionally neutral, did not stay neutral when he looked at her arm. She needs surgery, he said. Tonight. Minj was standing in the corridor. Then do it tonight. It'll take 3 hours minimum. I'll be here. Park looked at him for a moment, then nodded and went back inside. Maya had been taken to a side room with a cot and a blanket and, somewhat inexplicably, a bowl of rice crackers that one of the guards had produced from somewhere. She had eaten 4 of them and then fallen asleep sitting up, the stuffed rabbit finally resting peacefully in her lap. Minj stood in the doorway of that room for a long moment. He was not a man given to extended reflection in operational settings. Reflection was something he did alone, late, in the particular silence that came after everyone else had gone to sleep. But something about the sight of this small person, who had done the most audacious, unplanned, ultimately consequential thing anyone had ever done by simply dialing the wrong number, made him stop and stay still longer than he intended. Cho appeared at his shoulder. The number, Cho said quietly. I looked into it, and it was registered to Lee Jian, deactivated 22 months ago, following. I know when it was deactivated. Silence. What I don't know, Minj said, is how a child in that apartment had it. Cho said nothing, because there was no logical answer to that yet. And Cho was smart enough not to fill silence with noise. Here's where this whole thing pivots. Because Minj didn't just have a history with that building. He had a history with the name on that number. Ji-yeon had been the woman he was going to marry, or as close to that as someone like him ever gets to certainty about anything. She had been a doctor herself, actually. Not Park's kind of doctor. The kind that worked in community clinics in neighborhoods that needed them, that came home smelling like antiseptic and conviction, and made him feel, briefly, like the life he had built was a choice he could still unmake. She died in a car accident 22 months ago. He had shut the number down himself. He had been the one to make the call to the carrier, had sat on hold for 11 minutes listening to hold music that was aggressively cheerful in a way that only hold music can be during the worst moments of your life. And yet somehow, a 7-year-old girl in an apartment building he had visited twice while Ji-yeon was alive had dialed that number back to life. He was still thinking about that when Sandra woke up. It was 4 in the morning. The surgery was done. The arm was set. She had 2 cracked ribs and a bruise along her jaw that Dr. Park had photographed for reasons he explained clinically and Sandra understood were practical. She opened her eyes to a ceiling she didn't recognize. The panic was immediate and physical. She tried to sit up and her body informed her in no uncertain terms that this was going to be a no.
Don't, said a voice.
She turned her head. Minj was sitting in a chair 3 feet from her bed. Jacket off. Sleeves rolled to the elbow. He had a glass of water in one hand and was looking at her with an expression that was utterly unreadable, not cold exactly, but contained in the way that water is contained. You understand there is a great deal of it, but the edges hold. Sandra stared at him. Where's my daughter? Asleep. 12 feet down that corridor. Unharmed. Who are you? Kong Minj. She waited for that to mean something to her. It didn't, which was information he registered with a small, almost imperceptible shift in his expression. Where am I? Safe. That is not an answer. It's the only one that matters right now. Sandra looked at him for a long moment. She was exhausted and in pain, and she had just been through the kind of night that rearranges something fundamental in a person. And still, underneath all of that, something in her brain was already cataloging exits, evaluating threat levels, running the calculations that 2 years of survival had made automatic. Did you do this? She asked. My arm. Did your people?
No.
Then who are you, and why am I here? Your daughter called me. Sandra went very still. She misdialed, he continued. The number connected to a line that belongs to my organization. I traced the call and came. You just came. Yes. With how many people? He considered this. Enough. Sandra looked at the ceiling. Something moved across her face that was too complicated to name. Relief and shame and anger all layered over each other the way emotions are when the situation that produced them is not simple. Darius, she said, is alive. Is he? He won't come here. He doesn't know where here is. She turned to look at him again. You can't promise that. I can promise significantly more than that. But we can discuss the details when you've slept. I'm not going back to sleep. He looked at her. She looked at him. This was the first of what would become many standoffs between them. 2 people who were both, in their very different ways, completely unaccustomed to not being in control of a situation, suddenly sharing a room and an extremely complicated set of circumstances.
Fine, he said.
And he got up and brought her the glass of water. She took it without saying thank you. He didn't seem to require it.
Now.
Here is what was happening on the other side of the city, while this very charged, very silent exchange was occurring in that clinic room. Darius was not sitting quietly in the apartment processing his choices. Darius was on the phone. He had cleaned himself up, changed his shirt, and was standing at his window watching the rain with the particular expression of a man who has been caught but is not yet finished. His jaw was tight. His voice, when he spoke into the phone, was low and controlled in a way it never was with Sandra, which tells you something important about Darius that Sandra had not yet fully understood.
They took them, he said.
A pause. Then a voice on the other end, male, older, with an accent Sandra would have recognized if she'd heard it, though she never had, not once in 3 years of marriage, said. Who exactly walked into that apartment, Darius? Minj's people. A long silence. Kong Minj. Yes. The voice on the phone made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a threat, but lived precisely in between the two. You have made this very complicated. I can fix it. You cannot fix Kong Minj. Nobody fixes Kong Minj. That is rather the point of him. Darius pressed his fingers to the bridge of his nose. What do you want me to do? Nothing, the voice said. Not yet. Let me think. And Darius, a pause with weight in it. Whatever you do, do not go looking for her. Not because of sentiment. Because if Minj thinks you are moving toward his location, the conversation that follows will not be one you survive. The line went dead. Darius stood there in the dark for a while. Then he picked up a different phone, made a different call. I need information, he said. On Kong Minj. Everything. Who he's moved against recently. Who he owes. Who owes him. But wait. Because whoever that first voice belonged to, whoever was backing Darius with the kind of calm authority that does not panic when you say a name like Kong Minj, that person already had a file on Minj, had actually been building it for the better part of a year. And here is the twist that changes the entire shape of the story. Darius Whitman had not come to Seoul for love. Stay with that for a moment. 3 years ago, a man who knew the right people had approached Darius with a proposition. There was an organization in Seoul, quiet, well-embedded, enormously profitable, and certain parties had an interest in understanding its internal structure. Not to destroy it. That was too dramatic and too complicated and too loud. Just to understand it. To map it. To know where the pressure points were. All Darius needed to do was get close to someone who had access to that world. Sandra, as a medical translator who moved through private hospitals and elite clinics and occasionally interpreted for clients whose names meant things in the city, Sandra was that someone. She didn't know it. She had no idea. She had never once suspected that the man who brought her flowers on that bridge was not in Seoul because he loved her. He was in Seoul because of her access. 3 years. 2 years of increasingly documented abuse. One daughter who was entirely, heartbreakingly real and not part of any plan. And one night when it all came apart because Maya dialed the wrong number. The wrong number that connected directly to the man Darius had been mapping for a year. Do you understand now why the word coincidence doesn't fit this situation? Do you understand why Minj, who trusted nobody and calculated everything, was staring at a call log at 4 a.m. trying to figure out what it meant that this specific phone, in this specific building, connected to his most private operational line? Sandra did not know any of this yet. She was sitting up in a clinic bed trying to figure out whether the man in the chair was dangerous and how dangerous, and whether the specific kind of dangerous he was worse or better than the kind she had just left. You keep looking at me like you're doing math, Minj said. I am doing math. What's the equation? Whether I'm safer here than I was there. He was quiet for a moment. That's not an equation. That's a certainty. The variable is what you do next. And what would you suggest I do next? Sleep. Then eat. Then we talk. Sandra laughed. It surprised both of them, short and dry and genuinely involuntary, the kind of laugh that escapes when the situation is so extreme your body briefly defaults to humor rather than break entirely. You show up at my apartment with a small army, take me to a secret clinic, sit in my room at 4 a.m, and your advice is sleep, eat, talk. In that order, yes.
Who are you exactly?
He met her eyes. Someone who answered the phone. She looked at him for a long moment. My daughter called you. Yes. And you came anyway. Yes. Why? He didn't answer that. Not because he was being evasive, Sandra would think later, but because he seemed to genuinely not have an answer ready. Like she had asked him something he had been asking himself all night and had not yet resolved. She let it go.
For now.
She drank the water. She lay back down. She did not sleep, but she closed her eyes and Minj remained in that chair, and neither of them spoke again until the morning came gray and wet through the single high window, and down the hall Maya woke up and immediately asked if there were more rice crackers. One of the guards, a massive man named Yoon who looked like he had been assembled rather than born, went and found rice crackers at 5:45 in the morning with the devotion of someone given a mission they genuinely wanted to succeed at. Maya accepted them solemnly. Are you one of the man's helpers? She asked Yoon. Yoon looked at the ceiling briefly, as though consulting it. Yes. Is he nice? A pause. He is fair. Maya considered this with the gravity that 7-year-olds bring to new information. That's almost the same, she concluded, and ate another rice cracker. Yoon reported this exchange to Cho, who reported it to nobody, because some things are better kept as personal treasures. By 8 in the morning, Sandra was sitting up and demanding to see her daughter, and also demanding to know, with increasing specificity, what was happening and what the plan was, and who was going to tell her, because if nobody volunteered the information, she was going to start extracting it herself, busted arm and cracked ribs notwithstanding. Minj, who had gone briefly to clean up and returned looking like a man who had not been awake all night, brought Maya to her room personally. The reunion was quiet and fierce and private in the way that matters. Maya climbing carefully onto the bed, Sandra holding her with the arm that worked, both of them in a silence that was not empty, but full of the kind of relief that doesn't have a vocabulary yet. Minj stood in the doorway. He turned to leave. "Stay," Sandra said.
He looked back.
"Please," she added, like the word was new in her mouth, and she was checking whether it still worked. He stayed. When Maya had settled against her mother with the absolute cellular certainty of a child who has found their safe place and is not moving, Sandra looked at Minj over the top of her daughter's head. "Tell me what I need to know," she said. "How much do you want?" "All of it." He pulled a chair closer. And for the first time since the glass hit the wall in that apartment, Kong Minj began to talk. He told her about the number. About Jian. Not all of it, not the deep parts, not the parts that were still raw, but enough. He told her about the building, about being there twice, about why that specific number connecting from that specific location felt like something more than coincidence. Sandra listened in the way she listened when she was interpreting, completely, without interrupting, her face showing almost nothing of what she was processing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You think the call meant something," she said. "Beyond Maya misdialing. I think very little happens without a reason I haven't found yet. That's either very intelligent or very paranoid. In my experience, the line between them is mostly administrative." Sandra almost smiled. "Almost."
"Darius," she said.
"What do you actually know about him?" Minj looked at her carefully. "What do you know about him?" "That he's been hurting me for 2 years, that something changed in him about 6 months after we moved here, and that there are parts of his life he has kept completely separate from ours that I stopped asking about because asking made things worse." Minj was quiet. "That's not everything, is it?" Sandra said. "Not a question."
"No."
"Tell me." He told her. He told her what his people had pulled together in the 6 hours since the trace, background checks, movement logs, financial patterns, the specific texture of Darius's life that became visible when you looked at it from Minj's altitude. He told her that Darius had no employment record in Seoul. No formal contracts, no tax registrations, no paper trail of the kind that ordinary residents accumulate without even trying. He told her that Darius's phone had pinged, in the last 18 months, against 4 locations that Minj's organization had flagged as operational sites for a group they had been monitoring quietly, carefully, the way you monitor something that you are not yet ready to confront. He told her that the man who ran that group, the man on the other end of whatever phone Darius had picked up last night, was named Victor Hale. And here, right here, is the twist that makes everything before it rearrange itself into a completely different shape. Victor Hale was British. Former intelligence. Privately contracted to a consortium of interests that operated in the gray zone between legitimate finance and organized crime, and who had for the past 3 years been systematically attempting to identify, map, and ultimately leverage the underground financial networks that kept organizations like Minj's running. Victor Hale did not want to arrest Minj. He wanted to own him. Or, failing that, to have enough information to make him cooperative. And the person Victor Hale had recruited to get close to that world, to move through the private clinics and the high-end hospitals and the corridors where people who mattered spoke freely because they thought the translator in the corner was furniture, was the man Sandra had married. Sandra did not speak for a long time after Minj finished. She looked at the wall. She looked at her daughter's sleeping face. She looked at her own hands, the one that was wrapped and splinted, and the one that was not, resting on the hospital blanket. "He married me," she said finally, "to use my access. It appears so. For 3 years. Yes. Maya is his biological daughter, based on everything I've found. That part appears to have been unplanned." Sandra closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were dry. She had gone somewhere inside herself that was past the crying part, into the territory beyond it that is quieter and colder and considerably more dangerous. He hurt me, she said, for 2 years. Systematically. And that was what? Cover? Control? Making sure I was too destabilized to notice what he was actually doing. That would be consistent with the profile. The profile. She said the word like it was a foreign object she was turning in her hands. Sandra. Don't. Her voice was not loud. It was absolute. Don't manage me. You can tell me hard things directly. I'm asking you to. He nodded.
Yes.
The pattern of behavior is consistent with deliberate destabilization, keeping you too frightened and too exhausted to pay attention to what was happening around you. Silence. Okay, she said.
Just that.
Okay. Minj watched her. Most people, he said, when they receive information like this. I'm not most people.
No, he agreed.
You're not. That landed between them differently than either of them expected it to. Not soft exactly. This was not a soft moment, but with a specific gravity that neither of them commented on. Down the hall, Yoon appeared in the doorway of the room with an expression that communicated that something had happened that required Minj's attention immediately and that he was very sorry about the timing. Minj excused himself. In the corridor, Cho handed him a tablet. A vehicle had been parked outside the building for 40 minutes. Different plates than when it arrived. The occupant had not moved. Darius? Minj asked.
No.
Someone else. We ran the face against our database. Cho paused in the specific way he paused when the information was significant. Victor Hale. In person. Minj looked at the image on the screen. Victor Hale was in his 50s, gray-haired, and had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent a long time watching things without being watched. He was sitting in the passenger seat of a parked car outside a clinic that officially didn't exist, and the expression on his face was the expression of someone who had already done their math and was waiting to see if you'd done yours. He knows we have her, Minj said. It would appear so. Then he knows she's heard things she was not supposed to hear. Yes. And he's not here to negotiate Darius's situation. Cho shook his head slowly. He's here to assess his exposure. Minj handed the tablet back. He stood in that corridor for exactly the amount of time it took him to make a decision that was either going to be the right one or the beginning of a significant problem. Then he went back to Sandra's room. She looked up when he entered. She read his face the way a woman reads a room when she has learned that silence usually precedes something bad. What happened, she said. The man who sent your husband to Seoul, Minj said, is parked outside. Sandra stared at him. Right now? Yes. He followed you here? Or he already knew where here was? Which is a more interesting problem. Sandra looked down at Maya, still sleeping. Something shifted in her face, not fear, exactly. Something on the far side of fear that is almost like clarity. The particular expression of a woman who has been frightened for so long that when something genuinely threatening appears, her nervous system barely distinguishes it from Tuesday. What does he want? She asked. That depends on what he thinks you know. What do I know? More than you did this morning. Is that dangerous? Minj looked at her steadily. It was already dangerous. Now it's just honestly dangerous, which in my experience is easier to manage than the other kind. Sandra absorbed that. What are you going to do? She asked. I'm going to go speak with him. And if that goes badly? He almost smiled. Just at the corners. Just briefly. It won't go badly. How do you know? Because I've been waiting 18 months for an opportunity to have that conversation on my terms. He drove to my location and sat in my sightline. Those are not the choices of a man holding all the cards. Sandra was quiet for a moment. You're going to use this. I'm going to resolve it. Those are different things. Only slightly. She looked at him for a long time. He held it, the look, the assessment, the complicated moral math she was clearly running about who exactly she had ended up in the middle of, and whether trading one dangerous situation for another was survival, or just a different kind of problem. Bring him in, she said. Minj blinked. Just once, Sandra. He came here to assess his exposure. His exposure is me. What I know and what I'll do with it. She sat up straighter despite what her ribs thought about that decision. I want to be in the room. That is not. I am not, she said, with the quiet authority of someone who has decided something and is not revisiting it, going to sit in a clinic bed while two men decide what happens to my life. I have been doing that for 3 years. I'm done. A beat of silence.
I'm done, she said again.
Softer this time, but not weaker. Minj looked at her, and whatever he saw made him straighten slightly, the way people straighten when they recalibrate what they're dealing with.
Fine, he said.
Fine, she repeated. And that was the moment. Not the call, not the rescue, not the revelation about Darius. That was the exact moment that something shifted between Sandra Whitman and Kong Minj. Not romantic. Not yet, and maybe not ever, and maybe that was not even the right category for what it was. It was something rarer than that. It was the moment he started treating her as an equal in the room. And it was the moment she stopped seeing him as a threat and started seeing him as something she did not have a word for yet. An hour later, Victor Hale was sitting in a different room in that clinic, and he had the relaxed posture of a man who is used to winning conversations before they started. He looked at Minj. He looked at Sandra. He had not expected Sandra to be in the room. The flicker of recalculation in his eyes lasted less than a second before his face smoothed itself back to neutral. But Minj caught it. And from the way Sandra lifted her chin almost imperceptibly, she caught it too. Mrs. Whitman, Hale said pleasantly, I'm glad you're safe. Darius's behavior last night was not sanctioned. I want you to know that. I want you to know, Sandra said, that I've been a medical translator in this city for 3 years. I have interpreted in 17 private facilities. I've been in rooms with people whose names I was trusted not to repeat. She paused. I have a very good memory. Hale looked at her. And I have been documenting, she said, quietly,
carefully,
for about 8 months. Not because I knew what Darius was doing, but because I knew something was wrong and I had learned that the only person who was going to protect me was me. The room was entirely still. This was news to Minj too.
He did not show it, but it was.
Hale's pleasantness had developed a structural crack down the middle. What exactly, he said carefully, have you been documenting? Names.
Dates.
Facilities. Conversations I interpreted that had nothing to do with medical situations and everything to do with financial movement and private arrangements. She tilted her head slightly. Would you like me to be more specific? Or is the general picture sufficient? Victor Hale was quiet for a long moment. And then he said, What do you want? Sandra looked at him with the clarity of a woman who has spent 2 years being underestimated and is comprehensively finished with it. I want my daughter to be untouchable. I want Darius to never be in a position to come near either of us again. And I want to go home, a different home, and live my life without looking over my shoulder. And if I can arrange those things, then what I've been documenting stays where it is, untouched, for as long as those conditions hold. Hale looked at Minj. Minj looked back with the expression of someone watching a chess match they're thoroughly enjoying but have not been invited to play. You'll want, Minj said mildly, to take her seriously. I've only known her 12 hours and I've already stopped making the mistake of not doing so. Sandra did not look at him when he said it, but something in her posture changed in a way that was almost invisible and not at all small. Hale took a slow breath. I'll need 48 hours. You have 24, Sandra said. Outside the clinic, the rain had stopped. Seoul was doing what Seoul did after rain, shaking itself off and getting back to business, the streets reflecting light in long broken columns, the city vast and indifferent and completely unaware that something small and enormous had just happened inside one of its unmarked buildings. In the room down the hall, Maya had woken up and was explaining to Yoon in very thorough detail the personality of her stuffed rabbit. Yoon was listening with the focused attention of a man taking notes for a report. Minj found Sandra in the corridor afterward, standing at the window, watching the city. He stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. You've had that documentation for 8 months, he said finally. Yes. You never used it. I didn't know who to trust it to. Another silence. And now, he said. She turned to look at him. This close, he could see how tired she was. Not the tired of one bad night, but the tired that accumulates over years of being strong in situations that should never have required it. And underneath that tiredness, something that was starting very carefully to surface, like a light coming back on in a building that had been dark for too long. "I'm working on it," she said. He nodded once. "Minj." He looked at her.
"Thank you," she said.
For answering the phone. He was quiet for a moment. And then, in the way of people who have spent a long time keeping everything at a controlled distance and find themselves, without planning it, standing a little too close to something real. "Called the right number," he said. She just didn't know it yet. Sandra looked at him. He looked back. And the city went on outside the window, and somewhere in a room with rice crackers and a stuffed rabbit, Maya was telling Yoon that the rabbit's name was Captain and that he was very brave. Which, honestly, was the most accurate thing anyone said that entire day.
Now.
Here is where you think the story wraps itself up and everyone goes home and it's fine. Here is where you would be wrong. 48 hours later, Victor Hale delivered what he promised, on paper, with the kind of language that people in his world use when they want something to hold. Darius's operation was quietly shuttered. Certain arrangements were made. Sandra was given, through channels she did not entirely understand but accepted, the documentation that would make her, and Maya specifically, permanently untouchable. Darius was gone. Not dead. Just gone in the way that people go when the operation they were attached to evaporates overnight and taking a geographic position becomes strongly advisable. Sandra and Maya moved. A different apartment, different neighborhood, still Seoul because she had a life here, a career here, and she was not going to be displaced from her own existence by anyone. She and Minj did not speak for 11 days. On the 12th day, her phone rang. She looked at the number. She picked up. "There's something you should know," Minj said, without preamble. "There usually is with you." The number Maya called. Ji-yeon's number. "I had it investigated. The deactivation held. There's no technical explanation for the call connecting." Sandra was quiet. "Which means," he said, "either our telecommunications infrastructure has a ghost in it or something else," she said. "Yes." She sat down slowly on her new couch in her new apartment, in the November afternoon light coming through windows that did not have bad memories attached to them yet. "Minj." "Yes." "Was Ji-yeon when she was alive? Did she work in community medicine? In neighborhoods that needed her?"
A pause.
Longer than his pauses usually were.
"Yes."
"How did you?" "I think," Sandra said slowly, "I interpreted for her once. About 4 years ago. Before you and I existed in the same world. A clinic in Mapo district. Translator for a patient who didn't speak Korean well." Silence on the line. "She gave me her card," Sandra said. "I never called it, but I kept it. And when we moved here, when things with Darius got bad, and I was trying to find someone safe to call, I put her number in my phone. Under J. I don't know why. I just felt like she was someone who would help." She heard him breathe. "Maya," Sandra continued, "went through my contacts. Looking for emergency." She scrolled to J. Minj did not speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice had something in it that she had not heard before. Something that was not controlled. Just quiet and human and briefly, entirely unguarded. "She would have helped," he said. "I know," Sandra said. "I could tell." Another silence. But not an empty one. The kind of silence that contains a great deal that neither person has the words for yet, and that both of them are, for the first time in a long time, willing to sit inside without trying to fill it. "Sandra." "Yes. I'd like to have dinner. When you're ready." She looked out her new window at the Seoul afternoon. "Why?" she asked. Not suspicious. Genuinely asking. "Because you said you were working on who to trust. And I think that deserves a longer conversation than a clinic corridor." She was quiet. And he added, "Because Maya told you that Captain the Rabbit thinks I'm okay. Apparently that carries weight." Sandra laughed. Not the dry, involuntary kind from the clinic. The real kind from somewhere lower, somewhere that had been quiet for a very long time. "I'll let you know," she said. "That's enough," he said. She hung up. She sat in the afternoon light. She was not fixed. She knew that. 2 years of what she had survived did not unknot itself in 2 weeks over the world's most dramatic meet-cute. There would be nights that were still bad. There would be moments when a door slamming made her whole body go rigid. There would be work to do, the hard, quiet, unglamorous work of becoming herself again after someone had spent years trying to make her disappear. But she was here. Maya was here. Captain the Rabbit was here. And somewhere on the other side of Seoul, a man who had answered a phone that wasn't supposed to ring was sitting with a question he hadn't had in 2 years.
Which is where we leave them. For now.
Because here is what Sandra does not know yet. The documentation she gave Hale, the copy she surrendered as part of their arrangement, was not the only copy. There was a second one. And what is in that second copy does not only involve Victor Hale's network. It involves a name that Minj has spent 3 years trying to find. A name that, when Sandra eventually looks at the file properly, really looks she will recognize immediately. Because she translated for him.
Twice.
And the second time she wrote something down. And if you think this story just got complicated, you have absolutely no idea what is waiting in part 2. If you made it this far, do not leave without smashing that like button and subscribing if you haven't already. This story has a part 2, and it is going to blow open everything you just watched. If you want it, drop part 2 in the comments right now. Let me see how many of you are there. Because what Sandra finds in that second file, what Minj discovers about the name inside it, and what it means for every single thing that happened from the moment that glass hit the wall, changes everything. Drop part 2 below. We will see you there.